Um, I wanted to start really by this has been a week when we've had a lot of discussion of the BBC and bias in the BBC, but the best way to start it maybe is by looking at Spooks, which is a highly popular drama series. This has really caused quite a lot of comment this week, and not for the first time. But I wondered, you saw it, didn't you, Douglas?
Yeah.
What was the gist of this story that has basically got a lot of people hot under the collar?
Well, it's not any single story. The problem with Spooks, which incidentally, it ought to be said, is a very, very well acted, very well made drama. Yeah. Superb cast and some of the best script writing, I think, as well on television at the moment. But nevertheless, it's been going off several series now, and something really has just sort of come to the boil about this, because in the very first series, Spooks did a single episode about a Muslim suicide bomber, which you'd have thought for a drama about the intelligence services would be a fairly major plotline these days. But instead, I mean, the Muslim thing has become this sort of elephant in the room of this program, and week after week, it's just been going to more extraordinary lengths to avoid it. I mean, we had Christian suicide bombers, we've had animal rights nuts, we've had just about everything imaginable, other than the Muslim thing coming back. And then there was this two-parter in which it seemed that they're actually addressing a Muslim terror threat. And it turned out in this two-parter that they weren't Muslims, they were Jews. It was all run by Mossad. And that was bad enough, but they sort of made their error even more egregious by the next week having another plot in which it was Mossad that was the problem. Now, if the BBC just came out about this and said, as I think they should, OK, we're cowards, we don't want to tackle the real thing. The one time we did address it in the first series, we had a lot of complaints, a lot of flack, we don't want it again. If they did that, then we might be more sort of receptive to it. But quite frankly, at the moment, it's a fictional series that's in the realm of fantasy.
Yes, yes. As you say, it is very well made, isn't it?
Yeah.
I wonder, sort of, really, Dawn, I mean, how much effect would a drama series have on people watching it in terms of actually influencing what they thought about an issue?
I think that there is a fear from the people that I talk to who watch Spooks, and I've been watching it regularly, is that people are going to become anti-Muslim. That's what I hear, and I'm like, how can this be possible? That's not what, I mean, if anything, it's anti-Jewish.
They're going to become anti-Jewish.
They're anti-Jewish, and, you know, this absolutely is like, the Israelis going to Gitmo. I was like, oh my goodness.
That's right,
because the Americans are evil for running Gitmo the way they run, you know. So it has a huge impact, but not the way that we would expect it at all. And it has nothing to do with the facts that are really real threats to the country.
But also, isn't it, I mean, it's particularly important given that it's about Secret Service people, isn't it? And I mean, you know, isn't that the most, it is, isn't it? It's the most,
it is, but
it is the most sensitive area, isn't it?
Comedy programmes. But I completely agree with your critique of Spooks. And what sort of interests me overall, and this links very strongly into Prime Suspect, I don't know if we're ready to move on to that.
A bit later, yeah.
Yeah, is that there's a sort of hypocrisy that operates in a great deal of contemporary television drama, which avails itself of multicultural paranoia, of that feeling that it maybe you maybe are going to be attacked by that rather worrying-looking black kid on the Sink estate, or the threat, the Muslim terrorist threat as it appeared to be in Spooks. It plays on our paranoia about that, and it goes, no, but hang on, you get it all wrong. They're Israelis after all.
Actually, I was going to ask, you mentioned this Tom Leonard piece, which I thought was very good in the Telegraph. It has been one of many because of this. This particular report that was, I think it was in the Mail on Sunday last week, or should I say it was actually about a meeting that was held, and obviously somebody leaked what happened at this meeting to the press. Tom Leonard says that the argument is kind of gathering momentum. In other words, it's not just anymore the usual accusations about the BBC, but somehow a penny is dropping. Do you think that's true? I mean,
I can't find much evidence to say that. I mean, it's unusual that we actually get to hear it. I mean, normally one gets the prepared statements put out, as was actually the conclusion that was reached before they actually had the meeting, and they put out a press release saying, well, of course, we're not biased, and was that Michael Grade or someone was... And, you know, so we're used to that, but this time we actually got to see some evidence for it. But no, and I think a channel like Doughty Street is important exactly because that bias isn't going to go away.
Give that man a show.
This also, it reminded what you're saying about the BBC sort of revealing itself in its comedy. The Spooks thing reminded me a little bit of one of the BBC's great hit of recent years, Little Britain, the comedy series. The reason being that Little Britain, its success, is largely reliant on parodying a Britain that doesn't exist anymore, or a Britain that actually never existed. One of the most gratuitous and I think kind of unfunny Little Britain sketches was of the Women's Institute as sort of closeted racists, or not particularly closeted racists. The thing is that the Women's Institute, last time I looked, really weren't the great power in the land. Nor were all of the other things which Little Britain had in its sights. And it's kind of pathetic if you're going to pretend to be a cutting-edge comedy programme or a cutting-edge drama programme when you aim for old women, you know, people with various disabilities, and think this is funny, and you don't have the balls to attack the real big issues.
But I think it was sort of the world outside London, which, as they were saying on some of that stuff about BBC bias, the BBC really doesn't necessarily understand. It's a very urban clique of media professionals who don't really engage with the rest of Britain and tend to think that the rest of Britain has sort of paleo-conservative views that they wouldn't like very much, and so they're quite happy to stereotype us.
I think I want to pick up on this point you make about Little Britain. Of course, it was trumpeted as being very politically incorrect. You know, I couldn't see that there was anything. Did you see it?
No,
actually,
I watch it all the time. I think it's very funny, but for none of the right reasons.
But it's actually not, you know, politically incorrect at all. I mean, for example, all the characters until this last series have been white, for example. Now, if you're really going to, you know, do a caricature of modern Britain, aren't you going to have some caricatures of maybe Asians or West Indian people? As you say, it's very traditional targets.
Yeah, and the same thing always underlying it, which is this amazing presumption that runs through it. And I can't see why there isn't more anger about this. The amazing presumption that runs underneath it, that effectively white British people are just racists waiting to burst out. I mean, an enormous distrust of the British people, and I think the British people have a reason to feel angry about being portrayed in that way and being pandered to in that way.
Well, what made me nervous about the bias report is it's being reported that the liberals, that the BBC is filled with liberals, gays, and multiculturalists. And it's making it sound as the people who question the bias are anti-gays, liberals, and multiculturalists. I said, this isn't exactly we're anti-against, but this is really what's happening there. So I'm kind of nervous a bit about how it's being reported, and because when I say that, you know, the BBC's bias, people say, well, you're a fanatic. You know, and you hate gays, you know, and everything else.
But also, they've actually, but by actually doing that, they've kind of captured the argument, captured the language. So if you do say, yes, this is terrible, you can automatically, as you say, seem homophobic, racist, and whatever. It's a form of kind of cultural Marxism, almost, isn't it? That's sort of gone through the institutions in that way. Do you think that's pitching it too high?
I don't really. I mean, for me, the great scandal is that, first of all, there's been a great failure to represent the diversity of Muslim opinion, which one would think would fit in with a sort of liberal humanist agenda, really giving a sort of multifaceted image of Islam, global Islam, which of course takes so many dissident worlds. Our shocking failure to investigate or even acknowledge dissident opinion within both the British Muslim community and Islamic states abroad. There are dissident movements in countries like Iran, for example. We very, very rarely acknowledge the existence of such movements. There are extraordinarily diverse forms of of Islam across the world. Again, we really don't represent that, and to me it's made the entire debate, whether from a neocon or liberal humanist point of view, extraordinarily black and white. Moreover, I've always had the feeling that that what would you do then position has never been investigated. Right. I think one thing that Tom Leonard's piece certainly did establish very forcefully is that it's perfectly all right for anyone, whether at a serious or a news level or at a comedic level, to suggest without pause for thought or for breath that Bush is warmongering moron. We may or may not agree with that, but the point is that that's just taken as read.
But
Yes,
I mean,
And
this is the case, surely, isn't it? I mean, I remember this with Reagan and Thatcher.
Oh,
going
it was
back.
always
Yeah.
You know, and it seems to be that whenever we've got one on at the moment, apparently, and that is a real flourishing of comedy again. It seems to happen. You know, it happened with Thatcher and Reagan. A huge number of new comics coming up who can basically get a laugh by saying just "bush."
It's,
you know.
it's laughter for people without humour.
Well-
I mean, it's laughter for dumb people. It's a way you can get a laugh. If you're a fourth-rate comic wanting to make a splash, you can offend Bush. Well, that's fine, because George Bush isn't going to come and hunt you down. You can have your underground anti-Dick Cheney movement. But again, I mean, where's the serious cutting-edge stuff? Where are they actually bothering to pull their finger out? The problem, incidentally, if I can just say quickly about the BBC, is not just this thing of bias. We could have had this argument about bias at any point in BBC's history. The problem now is a combination of bias and ignorance. Ignorance at a very high up level in controllers and producers in the BBC,
Sorry, ignorance how?
Ignorance on fundamental, you know, global issues of our day. It always amazes me how little BBC people who should be knowing more actually know at the moment. I don't want to name names, but I mean, you know, you used to have to get into the BBC, know a hell of a lot. You had to jump through so many hoops and do so many exams, and you just don't see people with that knowledge anymore. You just don't see them in the BBC. They've got the bias, but they haven't got the knowledge.
Well, they have a liberal tradition now. And I think it's difficult for the people who are on the upper levels who have just kind of come into this liberal tradition to distinguish the differences. So particularly with the understaffed, they're like, wait, we've been doing it wrong? Well, as a matter of fact, you know, there is an entire other side to a lot of these issues.
But I was going to say, I mean, the interesting thing is not so much the bias, which is seems very obvious, but why they don't see it when it seems so obvious. It seems to me, what we're saying, you know, there is a point of view from which they feel they have the entire circle of reasoned debate within their walls. And there's a wonderful book by Thomas Sowell, A Conflict of Visions, in which he says that it goes down very deep. It's really not a political discussion, it's a philosophical discussion, which is actually what I think Andrew Marr was saying as well. It's a certain view of human nature that if only we're all reasonable and we sit around and talk about things, we can come to an ideal solution. And anyone who disagrees with that must be either mad or wicked, because all reasonable people could surely see that we'll get there. So anyone right-wing becomes extremist, becomes out there, and not needing to be part
sideline
of the
from
debate.
that, which is a terrible thing, where they just make you know, moral parity between extreme opposite ends as they see it. I mean, I speak for myself. I find myself, you know, on the BBC quite often on programs like that being, you know, so they get me, or, you know, neocon, they think, and then they get an Islamic extremist. You know, I think, I'm not sure that's the argument, and I'm not sure that an Islamic terrorist and I are just sort of opposite ends of the spectrum, and I rather find it, you know, offensive when that implication is made. But it is the sort of thing, let's get the opposite of each other, and then we'll find the middle ground. I don't actually think that is the case, and I think their vision of that is often very warped.
How, you know, are we actually approaching this in the wrong way? It's all very well to complain, isn't it? But in that case, is it a case that there are no good writers coming from another tradition? Let's not just say right-wing tradition, another tradition. Or is it just simply down to the commissioning editors? I mean,
There's a standing offer at the National Theatre. I mean, they accept themselves as a sort of institutionally leftist organisation, but they've said, we will put on a right-wing play as soon as anyone writes one good enough.
But what they mean by right-wing play, I mean, they have. I mean, we're treated all the time to kind of plays about Pinochet and co. From a leftist perspective. I mean, I'd love to see a play about Allende or something, but I mean, the problem is that they actually wouldn't put it on. I mean, they wouldn't, because they will not concede the crimes of communism, because they will not concede the murders committed by the left. They consider the right to be the organisation that just organises genocide, mass killings and brutality. And they're not going to put something about that on. I very much doubt anyone's going to write it. So that's not actually right-wing. What would be nice would be to see some kind of conservatively minded play. That's a different thing.